The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street in Denver as Officer Marcus Thompson adjusted his radio and checked his watch. It was just past 7 a.m. on what seemed like another routine Tuesday in March. His German Shepherd partner Rex sat alert in the passenger seat of the patrol car, ears perked and ready for action. Thompson had been with the Denver Police Department for 8 years, and Rex had been his loyal companion for the last 3. The call came in at 7:15 a.m. Domestic disturbance at 1247 Maple Street. Thompson knew the address well. It was in one of the older neighborhoods where houses sat close together and neighbors knew each other's business. As he drove through the tree-lined streets, he noticed the usual morning activity: joggers, dog walkers, and people heading to work. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sarah and Emma Mitchell, 23-year-old identical twins, had been living together in the small 2-bedroom house for just over a year. Both worked at the local community college, Sarah as a librarian and Emma as an administrative assistant. They shared everything: clothes, friends, and unfortunately their complicated relationship with Emma's boyfriend, Jake Morrison. The twins had always been inseparable, but lately, tension had been building in their small home. Jake Morrison was a construction worker with a quick temper and a drinking problem that had been getting worse over the past 6 months. He had been staying at the house more frequently, despite Sarah's objections. She didn't trust him and had repeatedly asked Emma to end the relationship. The arguments between the sisters had become more frequent and more heated, with Jake often inserting himself into their disputes. On this particular morning, the situation had escalated beyond anything they had experienced before. Jake had arrived at the house around 6 a.m., drunk and angry about something that had happened at work the previous day. He had been yelling and throwing things, demanding that Emma choose between him and her sister. Sarah had tried to intervene, which only made Jake more furious. The neighbors, the Johnsons, had heard the commotion and were debating whether to call the police. Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher in her 70s, had been awakened by the sounds of shouting and what sounded like furniture being thrown around. She peered through her bedroom curtains and could see shadows moving frantically behind the drawn curtains of the Mitchell house. Inside the house, the situation was spiraling out of control. Jake had grabbed Emma by the arm, leaving bruises that would later serve as evidence. Sarah had tried to protect her sister, positioning herself between Jake and Emma. In his rage, Jake had pushed Sarah hard against the kitchen counter, causing her to hit her head on the corner of a cabinet. Blood began to flow from a small cut above her eyebrow. Emma screamed for Jake to stop, but her pleas only seemed to fuel his anger. He began threatening both sisters, saying things that made them fear for their lives. His words became more violent and specific, describing what he would do to them if they didn't comply with his demands. The twins had never seen him this angry or this dangerous. Sarah managed to grab her cell phone from the kitchen counter, while Jake was distracted by Emma's tears. With shaking hands, she dialed 911. The operator answered immediately, and Sarah, speaking in hushed, panicked tones, reported the domestic violence incident. She gave the address and tried to describe what was happening. But Jake noticed her on the phone and became even more enraged. As Officer Thompson pulled up to the house, he could see that the front yard was well maintained, with spring flowers beginning to bloom in neat garden beds. The house itself was modest but tidy, with white siding and blue shutters. There was no immediate sign of disturbance from the outside, but Thompson's experience had taught him that domestic situations could be deceptive. The most dangerous calls often came from the most ordinary-looking places. He radioed in his arrival and let Rex out of the car. The dog immediately began scanning the area, his training and instincts alert to potential danger. Thompson approached the front door cautiously, listening for sounds from inside. He could hear muffled voices and what sounded like someone crying. He knocked firmly on the door and announced himself as police. The response from inside was immediate and terrifying. 2 female voices screamed almost in unison, their words clear and desperate. "He tried to murder us. Help us, please help us." The desperation in their voices was unmistakable, and Thompson immediately shifted into high alert mode. This was no longer a routine domestic dispute call. This had the potential to be a life-threatening situation. Thompson called for backup and began assessing his options. He could hear movement inside the house, and the screaming continued. Rex remained at his side, trained and ready to assist if needed. The officer knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in determining the outcome of this situation. He had to make quick decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for the people inside. The quiet suburban morning was about to be shattered by a series of events that would change multiple lives forever. As Thompson prepared to enter the house, he had no way of knowing that his actions in the next few minutes would trigger a chain of events that would raise questions about police procedures, domestic violence response, and the thin line between protection and tragedy. The sounds from inside the house continued to escalate, and Thompson knew he couldn't wait for backup. With Rex at his side and his training guiding his decisions, he prepared to enter a situation that would test everything he thought he knew about being a police officer. Officer Thompson's heart pounded as he tried the front door handle. It was locked. The screaming from inside had momentarily stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made his stomach clench with worry. In domestic violence situations, silence often meant the worst had happened. He moved quickly to a side window, peering through a gap in the curtains. What he saw made him immediately call for emergency medical backup. Inside the living room, Sarah Mitchell lay motionless on the hardwood floor, blood pooling around her head from what appeared to be a severe injury. Emma was crouched in the corner, her clothes torn and her face streaked with tears and what looked like blood. But where was Jake Morrison? Thompson scanned the visible areas but couldn't locate the male suspect who should have been at the center of this domestic violence call. Rex, the German Shepherd, was becoming increasingly agitated. His training had taught him to detect stress, fear, and violence, and every instinct was telling him that danger was imminent. The dog's low growling and stiff posture indicated that he sensed something Thompson couldn't yet see or understand. Years of partnership had taught Thompson to trust his canine companion's instincts completely. Emma spotted the officer at the window and began screaming again, pointing frantically toward the back of the house. "He's still here. He has a knife. Sarah won't wake up." Her voice was hoarse from screaming, and her words came out in desperate bursts between sobs. Thompson could see that she was injured too. There were visible bruises on her arms and what appeared to be scratches on her neck. Thompson made the decision to enter through the back door, hoping to catch the suspect off guard and prevent further harm to the victims. As he and Rex moved around the house, he noticed that the backyard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence, limiting escape routes for anyone inside. The back door was slightly ajar, and he could hear movement from within, footsteps, and what sounded like someone searching through drawers or cabinets. The officer positioned Rex and gave the command to stay alert, but not engage unless ordered. Thompson announced his presence loudly as he pushed open the back door. "Police! Come out with your hands visible." The response was not what he expected. Instead of Jake Morrison, Emma Mitchell appeared in the kitchen doorway, but something was wrong. Very wrong. Emma was holding a large kitchen knife, and her demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the terrified victim he had seen through the window moments before. Her eyes were wild, darting between Thompson and Rex, and she was breathing heavily. Blood stained her clothing, but now Thompson wasn't sure if it was her blood, her sister's blood, or someone else's entirely. "Where's Jake Morrison?" Thompson demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon while keeping his voice calm and authoritative. Emma's response sent chills down his spine. "Jake?" "Jake left hours ago. Jake was never here this morning." Her voice had taken on an odd, detached quality that made Thompson's training and experience flash warning signals in his mind. Rex began barking, a sharp, urgent sound that indicated immediate threat detection. The dog had been trained to identify weapons, and his behavior suggested that Emma posed a clear and present danger. Thompson found himself in a situation he had never encountered before, a domestic violence call where the apparent victim had become the primary threat. "Drop the weapon," Thompson commanded, but Emma seemed disconnected from reality. She was talking rapidly, almost to herself. "Sarah always interfered. Sarah never understood. Sarah tried to take everything away from me. She called the police on my boyfriend. She wanted to ruin my life. She deserved what happened to her." The pieces of the puzzle began forming a horrific picture in Thompson's mind. There was no Jake Morrison at the scene. There had been no boyfriend attacking the twins. Emma Mitchell had attacked her own sister, and when she called 911, she had created an elaborate story to cover her crime. The domestic violence call had been a calculated deception, but Thompson's immediate concern was Sarah Mitchell, who was still lying unconscious in the living room, possibly dying from her injuries. He needed to neutralize the threat that Emma posed while ensuring that medical help could reach Sarah as quickly as possible. The situation required split-second decision-making with life-and-death consequences. Emma suddenly moved toward Thompson with the knife raised. Her twin sister's blood was on her hands, and her eyes held no recognition of the officer as a person trying to help. She appeared to be in some kind of psychotic break, completely detached from reality and capable of extreme violence. Rex reacted to Thompson's sharp command and Emma's threatening movement simultaneously. The highly trained K9 launched himself at Emma's arm, the one holding the knife. The impact sent Emma crashing into the kitchen counter, and the knife flew across the room, clattering against the refrigerator. But Emma's fall was harder than expected. Her head struck the corner of the granite countertop with a sickening thud. Thompson immediately called for additional medical support while securing the knife and checking Emma's condition. She was unconscious, blood flowing from a serious head wound. Within minutes, he had gone from responding to a domestic violence call to dealing with two critically injured women and trying to piece together what had actually happened in the Mitchell house that morning. As sirens wailed in the distance, Thompson performed first aid on both sisters while trying to process the shocking turn of events. The quiet suburban morning had exploded into a complex crime scene involving attempted murder, police response, and a K9 action that had potentially saved his life, but might have also caused life-threatening injuries to a suspect who was also a victim's sister. The backup units and ambulances arrived within minutes, but the chaos was just beginning. Thompson would soon learn that his actions and Rex's response would trigger investigations, lawsuits, and questions about police procedures that would follow him for years to come. The Mitchell twins' story was far from over, and the officer's involvement had created complications that nobody could have predicted. The emergency medical team worked frantically on both sisters as Officer Thompson stood in the Mitchell's living room, trying to make sense of the crime scene that surrounded him. Sarah Mitchell was loaded onto the first stretcher, still unconscious with severe head trauma that appeared to be from multiple blunt force impacts. The paramedics' urgent radio communications indicated that her condition was critical and that every minute counted. Emma Mitchell required equally urgent attention. The impact with the granite countertop had caused significant head trauma, and she remained unconscious as the second medical team prepared her for transport. The irony was not lost on Thompson. The K9 action that had potentially saved his life had also created another victim in an already tragic situation. Detective Maria Rodriguez arrived at the scene 30 minutes after the ambulances had departed for Denver General Hospital. As the lead investigator for domestic violence cases, she had seen her share of complicated situations, but the initial report from Officer Thompson raised more questions than answers. The supposed male perpetrator was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of forced entry, and the evidence suggested something far more sinister than a typical domestic dispute. Rodriguez began her investigation by interviewing Thompson in detail about his observations and actions. The officer's account was thorough and professional, but she could see the stress and confusion in his eyes. He had responded to what he believed was a life-threatening domestic violence situation, only to discover that the apparent victim was actually the perpetrator, and his necessary response had created additional casualties. The crime scene investigation revealed disturbing details about what had actually occurred in the Mitchell house that morning. Bloodstain pattern analysis indicated that Sarah had been attacked in multiple locations throughout the house, suggesting that she had tried to escape her attacker. The kitchen showed signs of a violent struggle, with overturned chairs, broken dishes, and blood spatter on the walls and cabinets. Most significantly, there was no evidence that Jake Morrison had ever been in the house that morning. His fingerprints were found in the bedroom and living areas, consistent with someone who had been staying there regularly, but there were no fresh prints in the kitchen or other areas where the violence had occurred. Phone records would later confirm that Jake had been at work since 5 a.m. that morning, with multiple witnesses to verify his whereabouts. Emma's cell phone contained disturbing evidence that painted a picture of a woman in severe psychological distress. Text messages to friends and family members over the previous weeks revealed increasing paranoia and jealousy toward her twin sister. She had accused Sarah of trying to steal Jake's affections, of sabotaging her job at the community college, and of plotting to have her committed to a mental health facility. The most chilling discovery was a draft email on Emma's phone that had never been sent. Written just hours before the attack, it detailed her resentment towards Sarah and her belief that the only way to solve their problems was to eliminate her sister entirely. The email contained specific plans for attacking Sarah and then calling the police to report that Jake had been the perpetrator. At Denver General Hospital, the medical teams were fighting to save both sisters' lives. Sarah's injuries included a severe concussion, skull fracture, and significant blood loss from multiple head wounds. The trauma surgeon explained to the investigating team that the injuries were consistent with repeated blows from a heavy object, likely the cast iron skillet that had been found covered in blood and hair in the Mitchell kitchen. Emma's condition was equally serious. The impact with the countertop had caused brain swelling, and doctors were working to relieve the pressure while monitoring for signs of permanent brain damage. The medical team faced the ethical complexity of treating a patient who was simultaneously a victim of police action and a perpetrator of attempted murder. Word of the incident spread quickly through the Denver Police Department and the local media. The initial reports were confusing and contradictory, with some sources describing a heroic police response to domestic violence and others questioning the use of a K-9 unit in a situation involving a woman with apparent mental health issues. The complexity of the case made it impossible to create a simple narrative that satisfied everyone. Officer Thompson found himself at the center of a growing controversy. Police union representatives assured him that his actions had been justified and necessary, given the immediate threat to his life and Emma's clearly dangerous behavior. However, mental health advocates and some community leaders began questioning whether alternative de-escalation techniques should have been attempted before releasing Rex to subdue Emma. The investigation revealed that Emma Mitchell had been struggling with mental health issues for several months, but had hidden the severity of her condition from everyone except her sister Sarah. Friends and co-workers described Emma as having become increasingly isolated and paranoid, but no one had realized the extent of her psychological deterioration or the danger she posed to others. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the case, explained that Emma appeared to be suffering from a severe psychotic break, possibly triggered by stress, jealousy, and an undiagnosed mental illness. The combination of factors had created a perfect storm that led to the violent attack on her sister and the elaborate deception designed to cover up the crime. The legal implications of the case were staggering. If Emma survived her injuries, she would face charges of attempted murder, filing a false police report, and assault with a deadly weapon. If she died from her injuries, questions would arise about whether Officer Thompson and Rex had used excessive force in subduing someone who was clearly mentally ill and potentially not responsible for her actions. Meanwhile, the Mitchell family was devastated by the revelation that one daughter had nearly killed the other. Their parents, who lived across the country in Oregon, flew to Denver immediately upon hearing the news. They struggled to understand how Emma's mental health had deteriorated so severely, without anyone recognizing the warning signs or intervening before tragedy struck. The case highlighted significant gaps in mental health services and domestic violence response protocols. Emma had been crying out for help in her own way, but the system had failed to recognize or respond to her needs before she became dangerous to herself and others. The tragedy raised questions about how to better identify and assist people in psychological crisis before they harm themselves or innocent victims. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah Mitchell opened her eyes in the intensive care unit of Denver General Hospital. Her recovery had been slow and uncertain, with doctors unsure about the extent of permanent damage from her severe head injuries. The first face she saw was that of her mother, Margaret Mitchell, who had been maintaining a constant bedside vigil since arriving from Oregon. Sarah's memory of the attack was fragmented and confusing. She remembered arguing with Emma about Jake Morrison's behavior and drinking problem, but everything after that was cloudy and disjointed. When doctors and detectives gently explained what had actually happened, Sarah's reaction was one of complete disbelief and heartbreak. The sister she had loved and protected her entire life had tried to kill her. Emma Mitchell remained in a medically induced coma in another wing of the same hospital. The brain swelling from her impact with the countertop had been more severe than initially expected, and doctors were uncertain about her chances for recovery. Even if she did wake up, There were serious concerns about permanent brain damage that could affect her memory, personality, and cognitive abilities. Officer Thompson visited the hospital regularly, checking on Sarah's progress and grappling with his own complex emotions about the case. He had saved Sarah's life by stopping Emma's attack, but he also struggled with the fact that his actions had potentially caused permanent brain damage to a woman who was clearly suffering from severe mental illness. The weight of these conflicting realities was taking a toll on his own psychological well-being. Detective Rodriguez continued building the case against Emma, though the legal proceedings were complicated by questions about her mental competency and the circumstances of her injuries. The district attorney's office was consulting with medical experts and forensic psychiatrists to determine how to proceed if Emma recovered enough to stand trial. The investigation had uncovered additional disturbing evidence about
Emma's mental state in the weeks leading up to the attack.
Security footage from the community college where both sisters worked showed Emma exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. She had been caught on camera following Sarah around campus, watching her conversations with colleagues, and even going through Sarah's desk when she wasn't there. Co-workers who were interviewed described subtle changes in Emma's behavior that, in retrospect, seemed like clear warning signs. She had become suspicious of Sarah's friendships, accused her sister of spreading rumors about her relationship with Jake, and had even suggested that Sarah was trying to get her fired from her job. The paranoid delusions had been building for months, but everyone had dismissed them as typical sibling rivalry. Jake Morrison, the boyfriend whose supposed attack had been the cover story for Emma's crime, was devastated when he learned the truth. He had genuinely cared about Emma and had been planning to propose marriage in the coming months. The revelation that she had used him as a false alibi for attempted murder destroyed their relationship and left him questioning everything. He thought he knew about the woman he loved. Jake's own investigation into Emma's behavior revealed that she had been secretly documenting what she believed was evidence of Sarah's efforts to sabotage their relationship. Emma's laptop contained hundreds of photos taken without Sarah's knowledge, detailed notes about Sarah's daily activities, and elaborate theories about conspiracies that existed only in Emma's increasingly disturbed mind. The case attracted national media attention as details about the twin sisters and the police response became public. News outlets struggled to create coherent narratives about a story that defied simple explanations. Was this a case of domestic violence, mental illness, police excessive force, or all of the above? Different media organizations emphasized different aspects of the story, creating confusion and controversy in the public discourse. Mental health advocacy groups seized on Emma's case as an example of how the criminal justice system fails people with severe psychological disorders. They argued that Emma should have been receiving treatment rather than facing criminal charges, and that Officer Thompson's use of his canine partner represented an excessive response to someone who was clearly mentally ill and not in control of her actions. Law enforcement organizations defended Thompson's actions, pointing out that he had responded appropriately to an immediate threat to his life from someone wielding a deadly weapon. They emphasized that officers cannot be expected to diagnose mental illness in split-second, life-threatening situations, and that Thompson's response had prevented additional violence and potentially saved his own life. The Mitchell family found themselves at the center of a media storm and public debate that added another layer of trauma to their already devastating situation. Margaret and Robert Mitchell struggled to understand how one daughter had tried to kill the other, while maintaining love and support for both of their children. They faced the impossible task of hoping for Emma's recovery, while also seeking justice for what she had done to Sarah. Sarah's physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily. However, the emotional and psychological trauma of discovering that her twin sister had tried to murder her was proving even more difficult to heal. She underwent extensive counseling to process the betrayal, the violence, and the complex grief of losing the sister she thought she knew, while that same sister lay fighting for her life in another part of the hospital. The legal complexities of the case continued to multiply as Emma remained unconscious. If she never woke up, there could be no trial and no formal resolution to the criminal charges against her. If she did recover but with severe brain damage, questions would arise about her competency to stand trial and her mental state at the time of the attack. The Denver Police Department initiated its own internal investigation into the incident, examining whether proper procedures had been followed and whether alternative approaches might have been possible. While the investigation ultimately cleared Officer Thompson of wrongdoing, it led to new training protocols for responding to situations involving people with apparent mental health crises. Rex, the German Shepherd whose actions had stopped Emma's attack, continued his duties with the police department, but Thompson noticed changes in his partner's behavior. The highly trained dog seemed more cautious and less confident, as if he too was processing the trauma of that morning in the Mitchell house. Animal behavior experts explained that police dogs can experience stress and trauma from violent encounters, just as their human partners do. Community members in the Mitchells' neighborhood struggled to make sense of the tragedy that had occurred in their quiet suburban enclave. The house at 1247 Maple Street stood empty, its windows boarded up and its garden slowly being reclaimed by weeds. Neighbors reported feeling less secure in their own homes, wondering what other secrets and dangers might be hidden behind the facades of ordinary-looking houses. 6 weeks after the attack, Emma Mitchell's eyes fluttered open in the hospital's neurological intensive care unit. Her parents, who had been alternating shifts at her bedside, immediately called for the medical team. However, the woman who awakened was not the same person who had attacked her sister that March morning. The brain injury had fundamentally altered Emma's personality, memory, and cognitive abilities. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the neurosurgeon overseeing Emma's care, explained to the family that the damage to Emma's brain was extensive and permanent. While she had regained consciousness and basic motor functions, her short-term memory was severely compromised, and she showed no recollection of the events leading up to or during the attack on Sarah. More disturbing was her apparent inability to understand the gravity of what she had done. When Detective Rodriguez attempted to interview Emma for the first time since her awakening, the results were both heartbreaking and frustrating. Emma repeatedly asked about Sarah's whereabouts, expressing concern that her sister might be late for work. She had no memory of the attack, the police response, or even the existence of Jake Morrison. The Emma who had carefully planned her sister's murder and crafted an elaborate cover story was gone, replaced by someone with the emotional and intellectual capacity of a confused child. Sarah, meanwhile, had been discharged from the hospital but was living with her parents in Oregon, while undergoing intensive physical and psychological rehabilitation. The news of Emma's awakening brought a complex mix of relief and dread. She was grateful that her sister was alive, but the prospect of facing Emma again, even an Emma who didn't remember the attack, was almost unbearable. The legal system struggled with how to proceed with a defendant who could not remember her crimes and might not be competent to stand trial. District Attorney Michael Stevens convened a panel of forensic psychiatrists and legal experts to evaluate Emma's mental state and determine whether prosecution would be possible or appropriate under the circumstances. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Emma, spent weeks conducting assessments and interviews. His report concluded that while Emma was no longer an immediate danger to others, she also lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the charges against her or assist in her own defense. The brain injury had essentially created a new person with no connection to the woman who had committed the attempted murder. The ethical and legal questions surrounding Emma's case attracted attention from academic institutions and legal scholars across the country. How do you prosecute someone who no longer exists in any meaningful sense? What purpose would imprisonment serve for someone who cannot remember their crimes and poses no future threat? These questions challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation. Officer Thompson continued to struggle with his role in Emma's brain injury. Department counselors and peer support officers assured him that his actions had been justified and necessary, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed both sisters. His sleep was haunted by nightmares of that morning, and he found himself second-guessing every decision he made on patrol. Rex, Thompson's canine partner, was also showing signs of long-term stress from the incident. The police department's veterinary consultant recommended that Rex be retired from active duty and placed in a therapeutic role, working with other officers who had experienced traumatic incidents. The decision was difficult for Thompson, as Rex had been his partner and closest companion for years. Jake Morrison attempted to visit Emma in the hospital, hoping to find some closure or understanding about what had happened to the woman he had planned to marry. However, Emma showed no recognition of him whatsoever. To her, he was a complete stranger, and his attempts to remind her of their relationship only caused her confusion and distress. Jake left the hospital more heartbroken and bewildered than before. The Mitchell family faced the impossible task of caring for two daughters who had both been forever changed by that March morning. Sarah needed ongoing therapy to process her trauma and learn to trust people again. Emma required round-the-clock care and supervision, essentially becoming a dependent adult who would need lifetime support and monitoring. Margaret Mitchell, the sister's mother, found herself grieving for the daughter Emma had been while simultaneously caring for the person she had become. The Emma who awakened from the coma was gentle, confused and childlike, nothing like the paranoid, violent woman who had tried to kill Sarah. It was as if she was mourning one daughter while learning to love a completely different person who happened to inhabit Emma's body. Financial pressures mounted for the Mitchell family as medical bills accumulated and both daughters required extensive ongoing care. Sarah's physical injuries were healing, but she needed specialized therapy for trauma recovery. Emma's care was even more expensive, requiring full-time supervision and specialized neurological treatment that would continue for the rest of her life. The district attorney ultimately decided not to prosecute Emma for the attempted murder, concluding that justice could not be served by prosecuting someone who had no memory of their crimes and posed no future danger. However, the decision was controversial, with some arguing that it set a dangerous precedent that could be exploited by criminals claiming brain injury or mental illness. Civil lawsuits emerged as various parties sought compensation and accountability for the damages caused by the incident. Sarah filed a lawsuit against the police department, arguing that Officer Thompson's use of excessive force had deprived her of justice by making it impossible to prosecute Emma. The Mitchell family also faced potential lawsuits from Jake Morrison and others, who had been affected by Emma's false accusations and the subsequent investigation. The community where the Mitchell sisters had lived struggled to process the tragedy and its aftermath. Mental health awareness programs were established at the community college where both sisters had worked, and local law enforcement began receiving additional training in recognizing and responding to mental health crises. Support groups formed for families dealing with similar situations, cases where mental illness had led to violence and where brain injury had fundamentally altered someone's personality and capabilities. The Mitchell case became a reference point for discussing the complex intersections of mental health, criminal justice, and family trauma. Sarah slowly began the process of rebuilding her life, but she remained haunted by questions about what signs she might have missed in Emma's deteriorating mental state. She struggled with guilt about not getting Emma help sooner, even though mental health professionals assured her that Emma had become skilled at hiding her paranoid delusions and that earlier intervention might not have prevented the tragedy. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, all the people involved in the case found themselves reflecting on how one morning had changed so many lives forever. Officer Thompson was on extended leave, receiving counseling for post-traumatic stress. Emma was in a specialized care facility, unaware of the anniversary or its significance. Sarah was beginning to rebuild her life, but would forever carry the physical and emotional scars of her sister's attack. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a small audience at the National Conference on Mental Health Crisis Response. Her speech, titled, "When the Person You Trust Most Becomes Your Greatest Threat," was part of a panel discussion on recognizing warning signs of severe mental illness and improving emergency response protocols. Sarah had spent months preparing for this moment, working with therapists and advocates to find the courage to share her story publicly. Her goal was not to seek sympathy, but to help other families recognize the warning signs that she had missed in Emma's behavior, and to push for better training for first responders dealing with mental health crises. Officer Marcus Thompson was also at the conference, though he remained in the audience rather than speaking on any panels. He had returned to active duty 6 months earlier, but his role had changed significantly. He now worked with the police department's new crisis intervention team, specializing in situations involving people with mental health issues. His experience with the Mitchell case had made him uniquely qualified to understand the complexities of these encounters. Rex, Thompson's former K-9 partner, had found a new purpose working with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The therapy dog program had been remarkably successful, and Rex seemed to thrive in his new role helping people heal from psychological trauma. Thompson visited regularly, and their bond remained strong despite their changed circumstances. Emma Mitchell lived in a specialized residential facility called Sunrise Manor, about an hour outside of Denver. The brain injury had stabilized her personality at a childlike level of emotional and cognitive development. She was happy most days, enjoyed simple activities like puzzles and coloring, and had no memory of her previous life or the violence she had committed. Her parents visited every weekend, caring for this new version of their daughter while grieving for the person she had been. The legal aftermath of the case had finally concluded, with a complex settlement that satisfied no one completely, but provided financial resources for ongoing care. The police department had agreed to implement new training protocols and crisis intervention procedures. The Mitchell family received compensation for medical expenses and ongoing care costs. Most importantly, funds were allocated for mental health research and community education programs. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Emma during the initial investigation, had used the case as the foundation for groundbreaking research on the intersection of mental illness and violence. Her work had led to new screening tools and intervention strategies that were being implemented in communities across the country. The Mitchell case had become an important case study in psychiatric and law enforcement training programs. Sarah's physical scars had healed, but the emotional ones remained. She had learned to live with the knowledge that the person she had trusted most in the world had tried to kill her, and that mental illness could transform anyone, even a beloved family member, into a dangerous stranger. Her relationships with others remained guarded and careful, but she was slowly learning to trust again. The community college where both sisters had worked established the Mitchell Sisters Mental Health Awareness Program, providing free counseling services and education about recognizing signs of psychological distress. Jake Morrison, who had struggled with depression and guilt following the revelation of Emma's crimes, had become one of the program's most vocal advocates and volunteers. Jake had eventually found peace with the situation, understanding that the Emma who had loved him and the Emma who had tried to murder her sister were essentially different people. He had married a colleague from his construction company and started a family, but he remained committed to mental health advocacy as a way of honoring his complicated history with Emma. Margaret and Robert Mitchell had become unofficial experts on brain injury and its effects on family dynamics. They worked with other families dealing with similar situations, providing support and guidance for people trying to care for loved ones who had been fundamentally changed by neurological trauma. Their experience with Emma had taught them that love sometimes means accepting that the person you once knew may never return. The house at 1247 Maple Street had been sold and renovated by new owners who transformed it into a bright, welcoming home that bore no resemblance to the crime scene it had once been. The new family, the Rodriguezes, knew about the house's history, but chose to focus on creating new, positive memories within its walls. They had painted over the bloodstains, replaced the kitchen where the violence had occurred, and planted a memorial garden in the backyard dedicated to healing and hope. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who shared no relation to the new homeowners despite the common surname, had been promoted to lieutenant and now oversaw the department's domestic violence unit. The Mitchell case had profoundly influenced her approach to investigations, leading her to develop new protocols for identifying cases where mental illness might be a factor. Her team now included mental health professionals who could be called to active crime scenes. The media attention surrounding the case had gradually faded, but its impact on policy and procedure continued to ripple through law enforcement agencies, mental health organizations, and legal institutions across the country. The case was frequently cited in academic papers, training manuals, and legislative hearings about improving responses to mental health crises. During her conference speech, Sarah spoke about the importance of destigmatizing mental illness, while also acknowledging the real dangers that can arise when severe psychological disorders go untreated. She emphasized that her sister Emma had been a victim of mental illness just as much as she herself had been a victim of violence, and that society needed better systems for identifying and helping people before they became dangerous. "I lost my sister twice," Sarah told the audience, her voice steady but emotional. "I lost her first to mental illness when the paranoid delusions took over her mind and made her someone I didn't recognize. Then I lost her again to brain injury, when the person who tried to kill me disappeared forever, leaving behind someone who looks like Emma but isn't really her at all." The audience listened in respectful silence as Sarah continued. "But I've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving. It means understanding that mental illness is a disease that can destroy families and lives, and that we all have a responsibility to recognize the warning signs and get help before tragedies occur." Officer Thompson approached Sarah after her speech, and they spoke privately for the first time since the incident. Both had been changed by that March morning, and both carried guilt and trauma that would probably never fully disappear. However, they had also both found ways to channel their experiences into positive change for others. "I think about that morning every day," Thompson told Sarah. "I wonder if there was something different I could have done, some way I could have handled it that would have ended differently for everyone involved." Sarah nodded, understanding his struggle. "I think about it too, but I've come to believe that mental illness had already taken my sister away, long before you arrived at our house. What happened that day was the result of a disease that none of us understood or knew how to treat. You saved my life, and I'll always be grateful for that, even though the cost was so high for Emma." The conference concluded with a commitment from law enforcement agencies, mental health organizations, and advocacy groups to work together on developing better crisis intervention strategies. The Mitchell case had demonstrated the need for coordinated responses that considered both public safety and the welfare of people experiencing mental health emergencies. Emma Mitchell remained at Sunrise Manor, unaware of the conference, the ongoing discussions about her case, or the impact her story was having on policies and procedures across the country. She spent her days in simple contentment, working on puzzles, watching children's television programs, and enjoying visits from her parents. The violent, paranoid woman who had tried to kill her sister was gone forever, replaced by someone innocent and childlike who posed no danger to anyone. As the years passed, the Mitchell case became a landmark example of how mental illness, family dynamics, law enforcement response, and brain injury could intersect in tragic and unpredictable ways. It challenged simple narratives about good and evil, victim and perpetrator, justice and mercy. Most importantly, it demonstrated the urgent need for better mental health resources, improved crisis intervention training, and more compassionate approaches to dealing with people whose minds had been hijacked by severe psychological disorders. Sarah Mitchell continued her advocacy work, knowing that she could never undo what had happened to her family, but hoping that her story might prevent similar tragedies for others. She carried the physical and emotional scars of her sister's attack, but she had also found purpose in helping others understand the warning signs of mental illness and the importance of early intervention. The twin sisters who had once shared everything, clothes, friends, dreams for the future, were now separated by circumstances that neither could have imagined. Sarah was building a new life focused on helping others, while Emma lived in a world of perpetual